Picture the single largest, most technologically advanced naval fleet the world had ever seen. Ships nearly 400 feet long, carrying thousands of sailors, soldiers, doctors, and diplomats, capable of sailing from China all the way to East Africa. Multiple decks, watertight compartments, advanced navigation. This isn't a hypothetical superpower fleet from a video game. This actually existed. In the early 1400s, you'd assume a civilization that built something like that was gearing up to become the dominant naval power on planet Earth for centuries, rule the seas, establish colonies everywhere, basically become the empire every European power eventually tried and failed to fully become. Instead, within about 60 years, that exact same government ordered the entire fleet dismantled, the ships either left to rot or deliberately burned. The shipyards shut down, and building ocean-going vessels made straight up illegal. They didn't lose a war to get to this outcome. Nobody defeated them at sea. They did this to themselves, on purpose, and the reason is one of the most fascinating political cell-phone stories in world history. Historically facts, the setup. Let's establish the scale of what we're talking about first, because the numbers here are genuinely difficult to process if you're only familiar with the European Age of Exploration timeline. In 1368, a peasant rebel leader named Zhu Yuanzhang finally kicks the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty out of China and establishes the Ming Dynasty, taking the name Emperor Hongwu. Rags to absolute riches, genuinely one of the more dramatic rises to power in Chinese history. This is a man who reportedly grew up so poor that during a famine, his parents and older brother died within weeks of each other. And he spent part of his youth as a wandering Buddhist monk, essentially begging for food, before joining a rebel movement and, through sheer ruthless competence, clawing his way to the top of it. Hongwu spends his reign consolidating and stabilizing an empire that had just gone through decades of Mongol rule and civil war. And he is, by most historical accounts, extremely paranoid and extremely controlling about it, which, fair, given the circumstances. He restructures the entire civil service, executes tens of thousands of officials he suspects of disloyalty over the course of his reign, and essentially designs a government built around the assumption that everyone around him is a potential threat. His son, Zhu Di, eventually seizes the throne through a civil war against his own nephew, becomes Emperor Yongle, and decides that being the ruler of the largest and wealthiest empire on the planet isn't quite enough. He wants the rest of the world to know it too. Yongle, to put it bluntly, has something to prove. He came to power through a civil war rather than a clean succession, which in Confucian political terms is a legitimacy problem. And one of the most effective ways to paper over a legitimacy problem is to do something so undeniably impressive that nobody wants to bring up how you got the job in the first place. Beyond the treasure voyages, Yongle also commissions the massive Yongle Encyclopedia, an enormous compilation of virtually all recorded Chinese knowledge at the time, spanning tens of thousands of volumes, and moves the capital to Beijing, building the Forbidden City as a permanent monument to his reign. This is a man whose entire governing philosophy seems to revolve around doing things at a scale nobody could plausibly ignore. So in 1405, Yongle commissions an admiral named Zheng He to lead what would become known as the Treasure Voyages, a series of 7 massive naval expeditions across the Indian Ocean over the course of roughly 3 decades. Here's where you need to sit with the numbers for a second. The first voyage alone reportedly included around 317 ships and nearly 28,000 crew members. For context, Christopher Columbus, sailing almost 90 years later, crossed the Atlantic with 3 ships and about 90 men. 3 ships, 90 men. Zheng He had over 300 ships and enough people to populate a small city. The largest of these vessels, historically referred to as treasure ships, were reportedly around 400 feet long, dwarfing anything Europe would produce for centuries afterward. Some historians debate the exact maximum size because, frankly, some of the recorded numbers sound almost too large to be true, But even the more conservative estimates put these ships at multiple times the size of anything Columbus, Magellan, or Vasco da Gama would later sail. To put it in modern terms, imagine if a country today built an aircraft carrier so far beyond anything anyone else had that comparing them felt almost embarrassing for the other side. And then imagine that country simply mothballing the entire program a few decades later and never building another one. These weren't simple cargo ships either. The fleet included specialized horse transports, water tankers, troop transports, and support vessels. Essentially, an entire self-sufficient floating city capable of extended operation thousands of miles from home port. Some accounts even describe dedicated vessels for growing fresh vegetables on board, and floating medical units staffed with physicians, because keeping 28,000 people alive and healthy across a multi-year voyage required logistics that most European navies wouldn't seriously attempt for another 3 or 4 centuries. And these voyages went far. Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula, all the way down the coast of East Africa, reaching as far as modern-day Kenya, decades before any European explorer would make it anywhere close to that region by sea. The crews on these voyages weren't just sailors either. Zheng He's expeditions carried translators fluent in multiple regional languages, astronomers tracking celestial navigation, physicians, and even Buddhist and Muslim religious officials, since Zheng He himself came from a Muslim family in Yunnan and understood the diplomatic value of having people aboard who could navigate the religious and cultural expectations of the courts they visited. This wasn't a purely military operation dressed up as diplomacy. It was, by the standards of the era, a remarkably sophisticated soft power operation, backed by an amount of hard power that made refusing Chinese requests a genuinely bad idea. This is genuinely one of the most impressive displays of maritime technology and logistics in the pre-modern world. And it's not close. The purpose. Now, before we get to the part where all of this gets deliberately destroyed, it's worth understanding what these voyages were actually for, because it's not quite what you might assume. This wasn't colonization in the way European powers would later practice it. Zheng He's fleet wasn't planting flags and claiming territory for the Ming crown. The primary purpose, as best historians can determine, was diplomatic and economic. Announce the existence and grandeur of the Ming Dynasty to the world. Establish tributary relationships with foreign rulers, where local leaders would formally acknowledge Ming supremacy in exchange for trade access and, frankly, extremely generous gifts, because Yongle wanted this operation to look impressive, not predatory. That said, the fleet absolutely could and occasionally did use force. When the ruler of Sri Lanka reportedly tried to rob the fleet and demanded tribute from Zheng He instead of the other way around, the expedition responded by defeating his forces and bringing him back to China as a prisoner, before eventually releasing him once a more cooperative local leader was installed. So this wasn't purely a friendly goodwill tour. It was closer to a demonstration. Here is what happens if you cooperate, and here is what happens if you don't. And we would very much prefer you choose the first option. The tributary system itself is worth understanding a little more, because it's easy to misread it through a modern lens as either pure exploitation or pure charity, when it was really neither. Foreign rulers who sent tribute missions to the Ming court received gifts back that were, by most contemporary accounts, considerably more valuable than what they brought. Which sounds like an odd deal for China until you remember the actual point wasn't the material exchange itself. The point was prestige, legitimacy, and access. A local ruler who could claim formal recognition from the Ming court gained real political standing at home and access to lucrative, officially sanctioned trade relationships. China, meanwhile, got to broadcast across an enormous swath of the known world that it was the center of civilization that everyone else was choosing to orbit. The fleet carried enormous quantities of silk, porcelain, and other Chinese luxury goods to distribute as gifts, and brought back exotic goods, animals, and formal delegations from foreign courts. At one point, a giraffe gets shipped back to the Ming court from East Africa, which the court apparently interprets as a mythical qilin, a auspicious dragon-like creature from Chinese mythology, because nobody in 15th century Nanjing had ever seen a giraffe before. And, understandably, a very tall spotted animal with an absurdly long neck looked exactly like something out of a legend. Court poets reportedly wrote celebratory verses about the qilin's arrival being a sign of heaven's approval of Yongel's reign, which is a genuinely wild thing to build state propaganda around. But here we are. So for about 3 decades, the Ming Dynasty operates the most advanced, most far-reaching naval program on the planet. Foreign dignitaries from across Asia, the Middle East, and East Africa formally visit the Ming court. China's presence and reputation expand dramatically across the entire Indian Ocean trading world. Trade networks that had previously existed in fragmented regional pieces start to interconnect in ways that noticeably benefit merchants and rulers from Malacca to Hormuz to the Swahili coast. By every reasonable measure, this looks like the beginning of a genuine global maritime superpower. Malacca, a small port city on the strait between modern-day Malaysia and Sumatra, essentially owes its rise as a major trading hub to Ming patronage during this period, receiving Chinese protection against rival regional powers in exchange for cooperating with the fleet's operations. It's a genuinely rare thing in history to watch a superpower project influence across an entire ocean primarily through trade relationships and formal gift-giving rather than outright military conquest. And for about 3 decades, that's essentially the model China is running. The turn. Here's where it falls apart, and the reason has almost nothing to do with anything happening at sea. Emperor Yongle dies in 1424 during, somewhat fittingly, a military campaign against Mongol remnants in the north, which was consistently more of his priority than naval expansion throughout his reign, if we're being honest. The treasure voyages continue briefly under his immediate successors, with a 7th and final major voyage departing in 1431 under Emperor Xuande. But the political winds inside the Ming court have already started shifting dramatically, and not in the fleet's favor. To understand why, you need to understand the ongoing internal power struggle happening inside Ming government the entire time these voyages were occurring. The treasure fleet program was largely championed and administered by court eunuchs, a powerful faction within the imperial bureaucracy who managed enormous portions of state affairs, including notably Zheng He himself, who was a eunuch serving directly under Yongle. Eunuchs in the Ming court held an unusual position. Castrated as young boys, often from poor or conquered families, they entered palace service and, because they had no family lineage competing for power and no ability to found their own dynasty, emperors frequently trusted them with enormous responsibility precisely because they seemed like less of a long-term political threat than ambitious noble families. The Confucian scholar officials, the traditional bureaucratic class that ran most of the actual day-to-day machinery of Chinese government, deeply resented this. These officials earned their positions through a brutal, multi-stage civil service examination system testing classical literature and philosophy, and many of them viewed the entire eunuch class with a mixture of professional contempt and genuine ideological disgust, seeing them as illegitimate power holders who hadn't earned their influence the proper way. This wasn't a subtle rivalry either. Throughout the 15th century, control over the emperor's ear repeatedly seesaws between eunuch officials and Confucian scholar officials, with each faction using every available tool, including formal impeachment, court intrigue, and occasionally outright fabricated accusations, to discredit and remove members of the opposing faction whenever they gained enough leverage to attempt it. Confucian political philosophy at the time generally viewed maritime trade and foreign expansion with real skepticism, prioritizing agricultural stability, frugality, and frankly, a certain amount of cultural insularity. From this perspective, the treasure voyages weren't a triumphant display of Chinese power. They were an absurdly expensive vanity project, championed by a rival political faction, draining the imperial treasury to sail around giving away silk and porcelain to foreign kings, who, as far as many Confucian officials were concerned, weren't worth the expense. And to be fair to that argument for a second, the voyages genuinely were staggeringly expensive. Building and maintaining a fleet of that scale for 7 separate multi-year expeditions consumed an enormous portion of the state budget. At the same time, the Ming government was also dealing with expensive wars against Mongol groups to the north and significant domestic infrastructure projects, including relocating the capital to Beijing and building out the Forbidden City, plus repairs to the Grand Canal, which was itself an enormous undertaking. Historians estimate the combined weight of these projects put serious strain on Ming finances, and reasonable people at the time could genuinely disagree about which of these very expensive priorities deserved to keep getting funded. So you've got a genuinely expensive, prestige-driven naval program, championed by one politically powerful faction, resented by another politically powerful faction that controls most of the actual bureaucratic machinery of government, at the exact moment the emperor who personally championed the whole thing dies. That is an extremely bad combination if you're trying to keep a fleet of that scale operational long-term. It's worth noting, too, that this wasn't a uniquely Chinese political failure mode. Every large bureaucracy in history has some version of this exact dynamic. An expensive prestige project tied closely to one leader's personal ambition, resented by the permanent institutional class that has to actually administer the budget for it, just waiting for the political winds to shift. The Ming court just happened to have this dynamic playing out at a scale, and with consequences that would echo for centuries. The decision. After the seventh voyage returns in 1433, the Confucian faction essentially wins the internal political fight, decisively. The scale of what happens next is genuinely hard to overstate. Ship construction for ocean-going vessels gets restricted, then eventually banned outright. Records of the voyages, including detailed navigational logs that represented decades of hard-won geographic and maritime knowledge, get destroyed or allowed to decay, depending on which historical account you trust, specifically to prevent any future emperor from being tempted to revive the program. A later Ming official, when asked to produce the old voyage archives for a proposed new expedition decades afterward, reportedly claimed the documents simply could not be found, which many historians interpret as a polite way of saying they had been deliberately buried or destroyed by officials who never wanted this conversation to happen again. Let that sink in for a second. This isn't just, we're not doing this anymore. This is, we are actively destroying the knowledge required to do this again, which is a genuinely aggressive level of political commitment to making sure a rival faction's signature achievement never gets revived. The existing treasure ships, left unused and unmaintained in harbor, gradually rot away. Some accounts describe portions of the fleet being deliberately burned. By the mid to late 1400s, the era of massive Ming naval expeditions is functionally over, and by 1500, building a seagoing ship with more than 2 masts is officially illegal in Ming China, under a policy sometimes called the Sea Ban or Haijin. The penalties for violating this policy were not symbolic either. Over the following decades, the Sea Ban gets enforced with real severity, including, at various points, forcibly relocating coastal populations further inland, specifically to make large-scale, unauthorized shipbuilding and trade more difficult to organize. An empire that had, decades earlier, possessed unquestionably the most advanced blue water navy on the planet, voluntarily legislates itself out of the ocean-going business entirely. Not because they lost a war, not because a rival power outcompeted them militarily, because an internal political faction won an argument about government spending and cultural priorities and decided the safest way to permanently win that argument was to make sure the losing side's entire achievement physically ceased to exist. It's worth sitting with just how deliberate this was, because decline makes it sound passive, like the fleet simply faded away from neglect. This was policy. Officials who argued in favor of even limited coastal shipbuilding for defensive purposes decades later were still fighting an uphill battle against a bureaucratic culture that had, by then, spent generations treating large-scale maritime ambition as inherently suspicious, wasteful, and politically dangerous to be associated with. The sea ban wasn't a single decree that got quietly ignored. It got renewed, reinforced, and enforced by multiple subsequent administrations, becoming something closer to permanent state ideology than a temporary budget cut. The comparison. And here's the part of the story that genuinely stings the most once you line up the timeline. Zheng He's final voyage returns to China in 1433. Christopher Columbus set sail across the Atlantic in 1492. That's a 59-year gap. Nearly 6 decades where China possessed naval technology and logistical capability that dramatically outpaced anything Europe would produce for generations and simply chose to stop using it. Vasco da Gama doesn't round the Cape of Good Hope and reach India by sea until 1498, sailing with a grand total of 4 ships. Zheng He had already sailed substantially larger fleets to that exact region multiple times, nearly a century earlier, with vessels many times larger than anything da Gama commanded. Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, often credited as the first to circumnavigate the globe starting in 1519, set out with 5 small ships, and only one of them actually made it all the way back. Compare that survival rate and scale to a Ming fleet that regularly crossed the Indian Ocean multiple times with hundreds of ships largely intact. If the Ming Dynasty had simply continued the treasure voyage program at anywhere near its previous scale, historians genuinely debate how differently the next several centuries of global maritime history, colonization, and trade might have unfolded. Whoever controls the world's oceans during the early modern period ends up disproportionately shaping global trade, colonization patterns, and frankly, an enormous amount of subsequent world history. It's not an exaggeration to say that the entire trajectory of European global dominance over the following 4 centuries depended, in part, on nobody else with comparable naval capability seriously contesting them on the open ocean during exactly the window when it mattered most. Some historians even speculate, admittedly in the realm of counterfactual what-if history rather than hard fact, that a continued Ming naval presence in the Indian Ocean and beyond could have fundamentally altered the timeline and outcome of European colonization across Asia, Africa, and potentially even the Americas, simply by being the first, best-resourced power already patrolling those waters when everyone else showed up. Instead, that door gets closed from the inside by the very civilization that had built the key. Europe spends the following century and a half aggressively expanding maritime capability, specifically because oceanic trade and exploration become central to their economic and political strategies. China, having already proven it could outbuild and outsail literally everyone, walks away from the entire project. And it's not as though European maritime technology in the early 1400s was secretly comparable and just needed a nudge. Chinese ships of this period used technology Europe wouldn't widely adopt for a very long time afterward, including a stern-mounted rudder for far more precise steering, and multiple watertight compartments, meaning a single hull breach wouldn't necessarily sink the entire vessel, something European shipbuilders wouldn't reliably incorporate until centuries later. The gap wasn't close, it just didn't matter, because one side stopped showing up. The aftermath. The consequences of this decision echo for centuries afterward, and not in China's favor. By the time European powers arrive in East Asian waters in force, starting with the Portuguese in the early 1500s and accelerating dramatically over the following centuries, they encounter a China that has spent generations deliberately disengaged from oceanic expansion, while European maritime technology, navigation, and naval warfare capability have continued advancing rapidly. Portuguese traders establish a permanent foothold at Macau by 1557, and over the following centuries, European trading companies, followed eventually by European gunboats, increasingly dictate the terms of engagement along the Chinese coast. A genuinely stunning reversal from a world where Chinese fleets once dictated terms across the entire Indian Ocean. This power imbalance compounds over time. By the 1800s, during conflicts like the Opium Wars, Qing Dynasty China, the successor state that eventually replaced the Ming, finds itself dramatically outmatched at sea by European naval forces, a genuinely stunning historical reversal from a civilization that once possessed the most advanced navy on the planet by an enormous margin. British gunboats, built with centuries of accumulated maritime and industrial advancement that China had voluntarily opted out of contesting, forced devastatingly one-sided treaties that Chinese historians still refer to today as the start of the century of humiliation. Hong Kong gets ceded to British control. Multiple Chinese ports get forced open to foreign trade on terms dictated almost entirely by outside powers. It's genuinely difficult to overstate how differently this entire chapter of history might have unfolded if the nation showing up to that confrontation had spent the intervening 4 centuries continuing to build on, rather than deliberately abandoning a 4-century head start in naval technology and blue water logistics. It's also worth noting this wasn't universally accepted policy even within China at the time. Throughout the Ming and Qing dynasties, there were periodic voices arguing for renewed maritime investment, particularly whenever piracy or foreign incursions along the coast became severe enough to demand a response. But these were almost always framed as narrow, defensive, temporary measures, rather than any kind of return to the ambitious, expansive naval posture of Zheng He's era. The institutional and cultural momentum against large-scale state-sponsored maritime ambition, once set in the 1430s, proved remarkably durable across multiple subsequent dynasties and centuries. Some historians directly connect this multi-century pattern of Chinese naval disengagement back to the political decisions made in the 1430s. Others argue it's more complicated than one single policy decision explaining centuries of subsequent history, and that's a fair point too. History rarely has one single clean cause. Domestic agricultural productivity, population growth, internal rebellions, and a dozen other factors all played their own roles in shaping the following centuries of Chinese history. But the symbolic weight of the story remains genuinely remarkable, regardless of exactly how much direct causal blame you assign to it. There's also a version of this story where you could argue the Confucian officials weren't entirely wrong on their own terms. Ming China, even after the sea ban, remained one of the wealthiest and most populous civilizations on Earth for a very long time afterward. And an argument can be made that redirecting resources toward domestic agriculture, infrastructure, and internal stability wasn't an irrational choice for a land empire whose greatest historical threats had always come from land, not sea. The problem wasn't necessarily that prioritizing internal stability was foolish in isolation. The problem was the timing. This exact choice happened to coincide with the precise historical window when European powers were about to make the opposite bet. And the opposite bet happened to pay off spectacularly for the next several centuries of global power dynamics. The nation that built the largest, most advanced fleet the medieval world had ever seen simply decided, through internal political maneuvering, that it wasn't worth keeping. So here's what actually gets me about this story once you sit with it for a while. We tend to assume that technological and military advantages naturally compound over time. Whoever gets ahead stays ahead, presumably, because why would anyone voluntarily give up a massive strategic advantage? The Ming Dynasty proves that assumption spectacularly wrong. Having the most advanced fleet on Earth wasn't the hard part. China had already solved that problem decades before anyone else came close. The actual deciding factor wasn't technology or resources or military capability at all. It was internal politics. A fight between two factions inside one government over money, prestige, and who got to control the narrative of what mattered. And the losing side of that argument didn't just lose the argument. They lost the ships, the shipyards, the navigational records, and arguably several centuries of potential Chinese maritime dominance, because the winning side decided the safest way to make sure they never lost that argument again was to make sure the argument's subject physically stopped existing. This is, in a strange way, a story about how fragile institutional knowledge actually is. It's tempting to assume that once a civilization learns how to do something as complex as build and operate the most advanced navy on Earth, that knowledge is basically permanent, locked in, impossible to lose. It isn't. Knowledge like that lives in shipwrights who trained apprentices, in navigators who kept detailed logs, in an entire supporting industry of rope makers, sail makers, and provisioners who built their livelihoods around a functioning fleet. Cut the funding, burn the records, and disperse the workforce for 2 or 3 decades, and that knowledge doesn't just pause. It genuinely starts to disappear, generation by generation, until rebuilding it from scratch would take nearly as long as building it the first time. Zheng He died during or shortly after the final voyage, depending on which account you trust, and by the time the political dust settled back home, the era he'd spent decades building was already being dismantled behind him. He was reportedly buried at sea, though a tomb was later built for him in Nanjing containing his robe and hat, since his body never made it home. A strange, quiet epitaph for a man who once commanded the largest navy the world had ever seen. The fleet that could have reached the Americas before Columbus, that had already reached East Africa before any European sailor got anywhere close, ended up rotting quietly in harbor, burned or abandoned, because somebody in a government meeting decided that was cheaper than admitting the other faction might have been onto something. Turns out the hardest part of building the most powerful navy in the world isn't the building. It's convincing the next guy in charge not to burn it. Subscribe.